afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. One announcement for you. I almost finalized the study guide for you. I will post it later today, so you will have until Thursday to consult it and to read it, and then to prepare for the final class. Review of the material for the final exam, so you will have everything like a summary of all the lectures, all the main points in all the lectures that you will need to take into account in your preparation.
So will we have class here on Thursday then?
Sir?
Class on Thursday?
Yeah, there will be class on Thursday, overview. So I will post today the study guide with all main topics, thesis, arguments for the have 2 days to review this material. That's essentially what we've talked about in class and read in materials. And then on Thursday, I will be just answering your questions that you might have about that material. So there will be no more topics from the semester. So we will finish today, probably slightly early. We will have just one small final touch, one small concluding problem or topic to discuss, and then we are done. I will add that today to the study guide, and we'll send it. We'll post it on Canvas during the afternoon. So hopefully we'll be ready then for the Thursday class, which will be just an overview. Did we fix the final exam date? No. So it's an online exam. So how about Monday 14th? Is that okay? Would you prefer it sooner or later than that? I can make it either. No, I cannot make it sooner than that, but I can make it later.
That would it be?
So you mean what time of the day? So I will make it like a certain window within which you can take it from 9 o'clock until whatever, 8 p.m. Okay. So whenever you want to take the exam, you start doing it, and once you open up the assignment, you have to finish. But you pick and choose when you exactly want to start. So then that would be Monday 14th. Is that okay? Everybody okay with Monday? Good. So then the Monday it is. And then we'll see. Hopefully we'll finish grading it relatively soon. I don't know what is the final date for submitting your final grades. That will be later on. I will post today also the participation grades for all of you. So you will know that, you will know pretty much where you stand in terms of. There are a couple of homework assignments to grade. I will do that as well. I will kind of clean everything up before the final exam, so you will know precisely where you stand. I still didn't do one thing that I promised I was going to do. I will eliminate the worst quiz from the count from your average. So one quiz will be out on which you did the worst. So that's still not reflected in your average that you see on Canvas, but it will show up in a day or two. So don't worry about that. Okay. Any other questions about these technicalities pertaining to the final topic?
Will it be like an hour to take the final?
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe even more than an hour, depending. So there will be slightly more questions than for the midterms. So probably I will give you more. What was the? You got 1 hour for the midterm. Maybe an hour and a half. I will give you slightly more than that. Maybe I will give you a slightly like a 1 or 2 additional essay questions. So I will give you maybe half an hour, 40 minutes. Additional to do that. So you will have, so don't worry about that, you will have more than enough time to finish the exam. It's an open book, of course. Exam. With the examples that will require you, obviously, to apply creatively the material. It wouldn't be just give me a definition that you can read in the book or in your class notes. It will require you to know what you're talking about. So with that in mind, prepare for Thursday. So read the study guide that I will send you today, and then hopefully I can help you prepare even better for the final on Thursday. So the entire class will be just discussion of the material. Today we're going to wrap it up. Hazlitt's book and the main thesis and the main arguments of the book. We will begin with a brief discussion of public works and the problems of employment or unemployment, and why people believe sometimes that public works can improve the economic conditions in a given country. What is the type of economic theory that stands behind this idea of public works as we would say nowadays, infrastructure investment or infrastructure spending? What is the theoretical basis to believe that this can be helpful for an economy? And what is the theoretical basis for some of the prevailing criticisms of that view? And eventually, once we are done with that, I'll try to wrap it up in a sense to show in a very brief overview how all of these examples that we use, the trade unions in minimum wage and tariffs and inflation and a business cycle and the machines, whether machines contribute or do not contribute to economic activity, how all of them fit within this model or paradigm or the concept of the broken window fallacy and what is the significance of broken window fallacy and so on. Okay, so with that in mind, let's start with the problem of public works. One basic idea discovered in this chapter, fetish of full unemployment, or of full employment, I'm sorry, is that sometimes people do not distinguish sufficiently between full employment or maximum possible employment of resources, including labor, and maximum possible useful production or production of useful goods and services. So going back to the basic definitions of the meaning of economics, the very beginning of the semester, that we said that consumer evaluations of products and the consumer needs, consumer wants are what drives everything that is going on in the economic life: production, exchange, consumption, and so on. So everything that everybody does is geared always towards satisfying consumer needs. And that's the final criterion of how successful the economy is and how productive the use of available scarce resources have been, how satisfied the consumers are. Maximization of consumer welfare, we can say. And that's a criterion of a successful economy. From that standpoint, then, full employment of resources is not enough, and it's not predictive of a successful market economy. Usually, empirically speaking, successful economies utilize or exploit their resources with a very high level, with a very high degree of efficiency, meaning largest percentage of resources are used rather than non-used. But that's not enough. Sometimes that could be not the case. What is critical is how efficiently resources are used rather than whether they're used or not. In some types of situations, it's better not to use resources, not to produce if what you produce is not desired by anyone, if it's useless. So you can imagine very easily a situation in which you employ 100% of your resources, human labor, machinery, capital, raw materials, everything that you have in a way of productive factors or resources, that you use all of that 100%, and still you're producing very little value in terms of consumer evaluation. So you always have to be careful when we talk about economy, an economy that works at full capacity, 100%, an efficient market economy. What counts is what you get out of production process rather than what you use to produce things. How highly people, buyers, consumers value what they got eventually. And only insofar as the productive resources are employed to produce those things that consumers want, they're productive. If they're not, they're wasted, essentially. So you can imagine a situation in which you're using resources, but you're wasting them by producing something that is unnecessary. And this is not just a theoretical speculation or just a curiosity that we can juggle certain ideas and come up with strange scenarios. This is something that happens from time to time. So this is something that happens, for example, in a typical recession. So if you remember our discussing the problem of inflation and business cycle, we touched on this issue, that the problem with recession is that during the boom phase of the business cycle, that everything looks great, that everybody gets profits, that investment is increasing and productivity is increasing and employment is very low, everything looks great. The economy is working at near full capacity and is producing goods and services. But we figure out, we eventually realize when boom gives way to a bust or a recession, we realize actually that some of these business projects were undertaken in error, that some of them are unsustainable in the long run. There are some parts of the economy that do not function well, that we thought they were doing rather well, but eventually it turned out that was not the case. But so for a variety of reasons, it's a complicated issue. Why is that the case? How come that we could have been deceived in the initial phases of the business cycle into believing that everything was hunky-dory? As I said a little bit about that, but we can even ignore for now all the complications of why is that so. Just accept that for some reason that's the way it is, that in the initial phases of the business cycle, we believe that everything is wonderful, and it is not. And when it is revealed in the course of the business cycle that some of the investment that has been made before was made in error, that the profit margins could not be maintained, that the costs of production are increasing, that some business enterprises are unprofitable, and so on, we are facing then as a society, we are facing the problem what to do about this fact. What to do if we have $100 million of investment or wealth invested, and we know that 20 million of that is invested in money-losing projects, and we have people who work in money-losing projects. So on the surface, everything looks great because we work in full capacity, 100%. Everybody is employed, but at least 20% of the people are in the wrong places, so to speak. There is a misallocation of resources. Not only that people are employed on wrong business projects, but also machinery is used or wasted on money-losing, negative marginal value products that decrease the value of resources rather than increase them. So there is this problem of misallocation of resources. And when our resources are used in a suboptimal way, they're used in a wrong way to produce things that shouldn't have been produced, shouldn't be produced to the extent they are. So that's one of the situations in which we realize that there is a disconnect between an economy that is producing an optimal combination of products, of output, and an economy that is working at full capacity. Economy could be working at full capacity and doing badly, producing wrong stuff, and vice versa. So that's one of the reasons then why in a recession, this process of liquidation of this excessive production takes place. That's a recession. Unemployment increases because all of those projects that looked great in the boom phase of the business cycle turn out to be unprofitable, and they have to be scaled down, liquidated, call it whatever you want. And then we have some temporary unemployment of workers. We have idle resources. Remember that phrase that we use. The resources, either human labor or non-human factors of production, such as machinery, that are not used to the maximum possible technical degree. Machinery is not used 100%, and less than 100% of people who would like to work can find a job. So that's superficially speaking, that seems like a waste for the economy. Okay, So you have 10% of people who don't work. If you imagine that those 10% people work and produce something, society would have been better off. If you imagine that 10% of the pieces of machinery and equipment and capital goods that are now producing nothing or producing very little, that those capital goods can be producing useful consumer goods, we would have been better off than we are right now. But the problem is that we cannot make it magically. We cannot invent useful, profitable business projects overnight. The alternative we are facing is between having 10% unemployment and 90% of people who work produce something useful, and having 90% of people producing something useful and employing 10% of people who otherwise would have been unemployed on money-losing projects, so reducing the total value below what it would have been without this full employment. So that's a problem. That's one of the most difficult problems in economics, that it's not only that we cannot understand very well what is happening in the economy just by looking at these big numbers. It's the unemployment rate, inflation rate, government debt, fiscal deficit, and so on. All those numbers that describe the economy as a whole, economy as one integrated whole. You have to look deeper under the surface into the relationship between the different parts of the economy to see what is working well, what is not working well. Your employment might be on the wrong business projects, reducing the value for society, or your low rate of employment might be very good because you're producing great value. It doesn't matter that not everybody is working 100%. So that's something that you have to bear in mind as a background of the theory of public works as a remedy for a recession. So you know what is the theory that public works or infrastructure spending is good for an economy which is in a recession? Who are those people who will be employed by the government on the public works projects? It's people who are unemployed, usually. So then the idea behind this is exactly the opposite. So you see these two ways of thinking about unemployment and optimal use of resources. On the one hand, you have this idea that Henry Hazlitt espouses, that maximum profitable production should be the goal of economic activity, not maximum employment per se. And on the other hand, you have this idea, it's a very strong, entrenched idea by Keynes and Keynesians, that maximum possible employment is the most useful proxy for maximum profitable production. That you want to maximize the way how you make sure that you have the maximum possible production is to employ everybody. So if the private economy cannot employ everybody, if the private economy is producing idleness of resources, a recession, then the government needs to step in and to make up for this shortfall, for this insufficient demand for labor and resources. So public works represent maybe the most significant and the most common way how government performs this function. Large infrastructure projects, big dams, high power plants, roads, railroads, all kinds of things that employ people and machinery and equipment that would have been unemployed otherwise, and pays them with money that is raised. How it is usually raised, we discussed that last time. Typically not through taxation, but rather through government borrowing. That's public debt is the preferred way of financing public works in a situation of recession. Then the idea is very simple. The idea behind this strategy of full employment is that people who work now on infrastructure projects will get some salaries that they wouldn't have otherwise have. They will spend those salaries on consumer goods primarily. They will spend much larger part of their income than wealthy people would do, which justifies redistribution of income to them, because poor people have their basic needs satisfied to a lesser degree than wealthier people. So when you give 100 additional dollars to poor people, they're going to spend a greater percentage of that on consumer goods than wealthy people who are going to probably save more and consume less. So then what happens as a consequence of this new spending power, this new consumption that stems from initial government spending on the salaries of people who work on public projects, public works, they increase demand for consumer goods. So that's like when you throw one metaphor that is sometimes used by the Keynesians, that you throw a rock into calm water, and then you have the ripples spreading in all directions in concentric circles, like the first, second, third. So this is the first circle here would be consumer goods industries. The demand for those products increase: bread, butter, milk, whatever, depending on the level of wealth of a given society. The type of consumer goods that are most affected will differ, but consumer goods industries will benefit from this. The demand for those goods will increase. So now what happens? So that's good for consumer goods industries. That's good for employees of consumer goods industries. More money, higher wages, higher profit rates for corporations that produce and sell consumer goods. So then you go farther. What happens next? All of those industries use inputs and components that they buy on the market from other firms. I sell bread, but I am buying flour from farmers or from other companies, or I'm baking cakes. I'm buying sugar from farmers, or buying chocolate from chocolate importers, and so on. So then this second concentric circle is the second ripple of this initial fiscal stimulus, they call it, this spending on infrastructure project. The second ripple, or the second circle, are those industries that are most directly connected to consumer goods industries, that supply them with the components of their own products. The demand for those products increase. So when the price of bread increases, that will increase demand for flour, that is increased demand for yeast, and then the salaries and profits of everybody who produces flour and yeast and all other component parts of that. So the same applies. Demand for cars increases, the demand for steel increases, demand for aluminum increases, demand for everything that enters into the production process of making cars increases. So then you have a series of these concentric circles farther and farther away from the consumer goods industries that benefit indirectly from this initial fiscal stimulus. Of course, it is less and less as you go farther from the final stage of consumer goods, but the entire economy benefits from this. So this is the idea that eventually you will lift up the economy. This process of public works will help the private economy recover. We have a recession, and now the demand for all kinds of goods and services will increase after a while, and the economy will get out of recession. So you have this formula that you hopefully remember when we discussed how GDP is calculated, how the total national income is calculated. So there are a couple of components. There is this private consumer spending component, C. There is an investment spending, which means spending on factors of production, essentially. Machinery, equipment, all things that are used in the production process. And you have G, C plus E plus I, that's investment, plus G. G is government spending. So this strategy is to increase GDP, the total on the left-hand side of the equation, by increasing first G, then G will stimulate C, consumer spending. People will get new money from the government, they will spend it on consumer goods, and then C will stimulate production of I, investment goods, factors of production. So this is the sequence, this is the expectation, this is the idea how you lift the economy out of recession. So then you see that this is one highly, let's say, engineering macroeconomic approach. It doesn't care very much about what kind of business projects are being propped up, whether these business projects should be propped up, whether they're profitable in the long run or not. That doesn't matter from this Keynesian point of view. What matters are the aggregate numbers, aggregate figures, the economy as a whole. If GDP increases, you're doing well. If GDP is going down, you're doing poorly and you should do something about reversing the trend. Whereas this classical, neoclassical Haslitian, let me use that term, approach that I described at the beginning, earlier on, this idea that you have to worry about whether resources are allocated to the most productive uses or not, it looks at the problem from the opposite point of view. Looks at the problem, looks at the boom, at the financial boom, at good times when GDP is increasing as a problem in most cases. More likely than not, you will have an overinvestment and excessive investment in the period of the boom that will have to be liquidated or limited later on. And then recession is a process of recovery. Recession is a process in which the business projects that are failed, that are dubious, that are unprofitable are being liquidated or scaled down or scaled back. What is it? Scaled back, I should say. So from this neoclassical point of view, what the government is doing through the public works programs is problematic because it lifts all the boats at the same time. It's essentially a system of subsidies or stimuli for the entire economy. And what we need is not like a mechanical, mathematical, even stimulus to everybody and everything. We need a structural change. We need that the business projects that are doing well, that are sustainable, to remain sustainable, and we need the business projects that are failing and unprofitable to fail. So we can then free up resources that are tied up to those business projects. We can free them up and employ them for something else, for something more profitable. So this macroeconomic view of the economic development and this, let's say, structural or microeconomic that looks at the individual component parts, individual firms and sectors and say, this should be liquidated. This doesn't work very well. You don't want to stimulate this. Whereas Keynesians say, don't worry about that. That's a fool's errand. You shouldn't waste your time with this analysis, this micro-analysis. Just throw the additional spending power, additional money at the economy, and eventually everybody will benefit. So essentially the Keynesian policy is to make the boom permanent, to outlaw the business cycle. If business cycle shows up, let's beat it over the head with additional money and government spending, and let's revive the boom. And when it happens next time, do the same thing once again. If it doesn't work very well, increase government spending. That's the approach. The approach of this opposite school of thought is, no, actually, it's too late to do anything useful. Once the recession begins, that's just a signal that's just like you get a fever. So fever is a symptom that you have a virus or some underlying disease. The real moment to worry about fever was when if you had a chance to protect yourself against the virus transmission, whatever you should have done. Once you get a fever, that's just a symptom. You better get over it. You cannot, as the doctor said that sometimes with the flu and coronavirus, you shouldn't be trying to suppress fever too harsh, unless you have a really, really high fever. That's moderate. Fever is a good sign that the organism is fighting the virus. You shouldn't try to suppress it. Easier said than done, actually. But most people don't do it, but that's the logic. So something similar is here, actually. Once you get a recession and unemployment, that's a signal that a large part of your investment and a large part of your productive structure was kind of wrong-headed. And you have to heal, you have to self-heal the economy. How are you going to heal it? By cutting off this cancerous tissue this cancerous tissue of unproductive, unprofitable investment that you undertake. So then from that standpoint of view, public works programs, they are positively harmful because they impede the progress of this process of recessionary self-healing. They actually encourage, they prop up artificially the business projects that should have failed. This would be the equivalent of trying artificially to suppress the fever while doing nothing about the virus that is causing the fever. So it's not in some older people when they have a flu or pneumonia or respiratory disease, they have sometimes they don't have fever, no, because the immune system is not strong enough to mount a strong response. People sometimes may end up with a very severe disease and God forbid die, but without fever. So that doesn't mean that they're fine. It only means that the main symptom of the disease is absent. So the opposite applies as well. You're not gonna, this school of thought argues, and it has that school of thought, argues that you're not gonna fix the problem by eliminating a symptom of the disease. That's a temporary squeeze on resources, temporary unprofitability, lack of demand, unemployment. Because what's going to happen once you stimulate all these issues, these business projects will not become any better in the meantime. You may prop them up temporarily, but once the fiscal stimulus dries up, they're going to get even more unprofitable than before. The problem still remains. So this is, I'm spending quite a bit of time on this basic issue that is not covered in depth in Hazlitt, because he assumes that everybody knows this. This is the background against which this Keynesian school of thought is something that he argues against. But this is the main fault line, the main dividing line, one of the main dividing lines in modern economic science, one of the major controversies. This thing that I talked about in the last 20 minutes, that's probably the most important problem and disagreement that exists in modern economic theory. What kind of perspective to adopt here? And it's not so easy as it might seem. You can make it look, either one of them look ridiculous and stupid and so on, but it's not so easy to make a decision. But you have to be familiar with the arguments, at least, before you come up with a certain strong opinion about what is to be done and how and why. So you see how this concept of public works is just a part of this broader discussion about the role of the government in the business cycle. So that's the main place, or let's say the main meaning of the theory of public works as an instrument of a government's response or government's reaction or governmental solution potentially to the problem of business cycle recession. Or you can evaluate the policy, you first have to ask the question whether the government, what is the cause of recession and whether the government can do anything useful to alleviate the problem. Or maybe it makes it even worse than otherwise, or not. Okay, so my goal was not at all to give you the final answer, just to give you some food for thought, to give you the context of the context of the debate about public works. Any questions as well? Okay. So let me then try and summarize briefly this entire book. What is the meaning? Why I decided to give you this book to read, and what could be its main conclusions, and why I think that this book is one of the best economics textbooks for beginners, for people who didn't have significant prior exposure to economics. Pretty much fits your description. Most of you This is your, for how many of you this is a first economics course that you take? Yeah, pretty much. Almost everybody. You took micro, yeah?
I took economics in high school.
Economics, but at college level, not. This is the first. Yeah. Okay. So why Henry Hazlitt? There is one criticism that we can level against his book, and that is he assumes some, paradoxically, he assumes some prior familiarity with at least certain economic concepts, or more with the economic history, certain degree. So that's one of the limitations. That's one of the counter arguments that one might level against my decision to include it. But on the other hand, its basic approach is very simple, and what you want from a textbook is a simple model, is a simple conceptual framework within which book operates. And in Hazlitt's view, this is this model of a broken window and broken window fallacy as the main paradigm how modern economic thought functions or doesn't function, and a simple criterion for distinguishing between a good economic theory and bad economic theory. So this criterion is crystal clear, actually. What is bad economic theory? That's economic theory that stays at the surface at the immediately visible consequences of certain principles or certain economic policies, and at the surface in another sense that it stays at the effects of economic policies on some isolated groups of people while ignoring the systematic effects for other groups. So then good economic theory would be, or good economic thinking would be this that takes into account a broader set of consequences, not only for one small isolated group, but for society as a whole, ideally, or at least for a much wider groups in society, and also that looks at economic principles in the long run rather than in the short run. And then the applications of that are really very fruitful and rich. So you will see that you can apply it to problems of tariffs, technological innovation, minimum wage, rent control, all sorts of things. And that in all of these cases, the prevailing economic fallacies always stem, as if by the rule, from ignoring this lesson. That's the reason why the book is called Economics in One Lesson. What is this one lesson? That good economic theory looks at the long-term effects and effects for all groups rather than one group. As if by the rule, the most popular economic fallacies always or almost always stem from ignoring this lesson in one way or another, usually in both ways, just looking at the short-term effects for some small groups and ignoring other things that are relevant. The second aspect why this is a very good textbook and why I would like you to read it carefully, even beyond the narrow reason of taking the final exam from in your economics class, is that it teaches you something crucially important about social science and about economics, and that is that you cannot rely, or that you cannot go very far just by looking at the empirical data, the empirical evidence, and history. History is a teacher of what is it? Historia magistra vitae est, the teacher of life. That's the old Latin saying. Many lessons that we can learn by looking at history, by looking at the past data, and so on. And this textbook shows you that this is problematic. That you can get many things really wrong if you limit yourself to the empirical data and to observing reality with your own eyes and ears, that you have to go far beyond that, that the most important task in economics is actually to think carefully and logically through the consequences of given principles, to engage in this counterfactual reasoning, to ask yourself the questions such as, what if this, what then? And so on and so forth. Or if you adopt this, what is going to happen? What is likely to happen? How does that affect my assessment that this is a good thing or a bad thing, and so on. So then this is a problem. And this is a problem in the following way, because there is far less objectivity in an intellectual endeavor that is based on theoretical reasoning, where your evidence for the claims that you want to defend is not so much empirical evidence of your eyes and ears, but it's rather a logical evidence of the consistency of what you're thinking about. That makes sense, logical. That's convincing logic. And so then people might get skeptical about that. So people don't like theory. People don't like philosophy. People don't like you to philosophize and abstractly think about things that are life or death issues, such as economy, what is a good economic policy. And that's a real challenge, and you have to learn that this is a real challenge that you will always face as an economist. That this way of thinking in economics that is theoretical and in some sense even philosophical pits you against common sense, against the way how most people like to think about reality and about economics in particular. So this book demonstrates this book is maybe the best short textbook presentation of this philosophical, quote unquote, way of thinking about economics. And it warns against the dangers. It shows, at least, we don't want to be too, let's say, one-dimensional or black and white here. There is a proper role for empirical analysis, but it's still true that by far the most important task in economics is to understand the data that we already have. That's one of the teachers, one of the people who influenced Henry Hazlitt, F.A. Hayek. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. He said in his Nobel Prize speech that I wholeheartedly recommend to you to read it whenever you have time, if you have any interest in economics. The speech is titled "The Pretense of Knowledge," which he actually excoriates this idea that you can have this engineering, scientific, empirical knowledge about economics. It's just a pretense of knowledge. He says our main challenge in economics is not so much to come up with the new data and better data and more refined data to test the theories that we already have, that we already developed, to distinguish between which theories are wrong, which theories are right. That's not the main thing. The main thing that we should be doing in the economy. Our problem in economics is to figure out new theories to make sense of the data that we already have. You see, our main task is to develop this interpretive framework, to develop new theories, new theoretical understandings of we already have more than enough data, more data than we can ever incorporate into our theories. Our main task is to develop critical categories to distinguish between which data is relevant, which data is irrelevant, how to interpret the data. So you know, the data never speaks. Facts do not speak, only we do, as American philosopher Richard Rorty said. So in order for the data to make any sense, you need some theoretical framework to place the data in. And that's the main task here, to understand the basic concepts in economics. That's a theoretical task rather than the empirical task. And this then fits, this is just a let's say basic methodological discussion here, what economic science should be. So I sometimes joke that, actually I've stolen this joke for the sake of truthfulness from my older friend and co-author Walter Bock. He said, there is something like a physics envy in economics. You know, this psychoanalytical crackpot theory that the girls have penis envy with regard to boys. And now is that economists have physics envy with regard to the natural scientists. Our discipline is not exact. Our discipline does not lend itself to strict verification and checking and unambiguous adjudication who is right, who is wrong, in the same sense in which physics and chemistry can tell you. This guy is talking nonsense because my experiment in the Large Hadron Accelerator had proven that the mass of the electron or the spin of the whatever, this or that particle is what it is. We measured it. So it means the theory that assumes that the mass of electron is 3 times larger than it is false, period. So now we are now upset in social sciences in general, including economics. We are sometimes upset that we cannot do the same thing, that we cannot adjudicate with the same level of apodictical certainty, let's say, what is wrong, what is right, what is false, what is true in economics. And then we try to apply those methods that physicists and chemists can use, empirical verification, experiment, and it doesn't help very much. That cannot work in economics. It cannot work for the simple reason that we are conscious human beings with free will. We can make our behavior cannot be studied in the same objective fashion in which the behavior of particles in physics or chemical compounds in chemistry could be studied, because we have the ability and liberty to change our behavior every given moment, and it's unpredictable. The very fact that I admit that you have a free will means, by the same token, my admission that I cannot predict your behavior, because you have liberty, you have free will to change your preferences, what you're going to buy, what you're going to refuse to buy. How much are you going to pay for this? How many units of Coca-Cola product you're going to buy in the next 3 weeks? So you can predict what's going to happen if the trajectory of a particle, if you know enough about the particle, you can predict what's going to happen. If you collide two protons, you can predict what particle will come out of that interaction. You cannot predict in the same way what consumers will want in 3 months, because particles do not have free will. Particles behave in a certain sense. There are some limitations to this, but essentially deterministic. Once you know the initial conditions and you know the laws that govern their behavior, you can predict what's going to happen in any given situation. Here you cannot do that. So then objective empirical analysis, what people do is not of much help. However you slice it, you observe something that happens now, that's just a snapshot in time. You observe that people bought, at this particular price, people bought 67 cans of Coke. You can now extrapolate from that and say there is a natural law that at the price of 6.35, people of certain description will buy 75. Yes. But the result that you are observing, the empirical reality that you're observing, was just a result of the structural preferences that existed before. And preferences depend on free will and decisions by millions of individuals that you cannot predict or control, even if you're a dictator. And we assume that there is no dictator in a free market economy. So then your observation of past events doesn't help you much in predicting what's going to happen in the future. And you're interested in what is going to happen in the future. What is going to happen in the future? It depends on the future state of minds in people's heads and decisions that they're going to make in the future. So if you take all of this into account, then you realize that economics, that this physics envy, this attempt to model economic science on physics and natural sciences cannot work here, and that we have to be a little bit more modest. That the laws of economics are not the same as laws of physics, that we accept them as some kind of approximations, as a useful analytical tools or models to understand reality, but we cannot prove them empirically, strictly speaking. So that's something that is plainly visible when you read this textbook, that it accepts this approach or this way of looking at the economic science, which is, I think, healthy, because we live in a society in which all too many economists accept this modern scientific approach to social science. This idea that we should model and can model social science in accordance with natural science, approach of natural sciences. And the examples that the book uses are reflective of that. It always harkens back to this idea: what you observe directly, what you see is just a part of the story, and what is the most important are some speculative consequences that are going to happen, probably, but that you cannot observe right now. Okay. Yeah, tariff is good because you can predict. It's very easy to see who is going to benefit. The steel workers and the investors in steel industry, they're going to benefit from the steel tariffs, but you don't see the chain of events that is created by this, that leads to the losses that are real and objective, but they're not really and objectively measurable in the same sense in which the gains of tariff are visible. So see this mismatch between empirically observable costs of harmful economic policies and empirically more difficult to observe and more speculative benefits then lead many people to believe that the harmful policies are useful, that harmful policies are beneficial. So this is a deeper background. What I talked about in the last 10 minutes it's a kind of deeper philosophical background of the book, in order to understand why he had chosen this particular approach. You have to understand the context of modern economic theory. That much more is at stake here than just whether tariffs are beneficial or not, or any particular policy conclusion that you may derive. One more consequence of this is that Hazlitt's approach is in general consistent with a free market point of view, or free market look at the market economy, which means that you should, in organizing the market economy, people should rely on certain fixed principles rather than on the creativity of government bureaucrats and technocrats to run the economic system. So see, there is this close connection between, on the one hand, this philosophical, theoretical approach to economics and confidence in the mechanisms, confidence in the market mechanisms. And on the other hand, this scientific or scientistic approach, trying to emulate physics, chemistry, and natural sciences, and social engineering approach. So what is social engineering? Have you heard about that word? We heard sometimes in our political discussions this term comes up. Social engineering. What is that? You hear it probably in other areas as well, not only economics. It's much more popular nowadays in other areas such as ethics and religion and family and so on. So what is social engineering? It emerged in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. American progressives were the first in this country to use, in an affirmative sense, concept of social engineering. At that time, that was considered to be a good thing. What do you think?
Managing like several aspects.
Yeah, managing the aspects of social life, how? Or changing, engineering. Engineering suggests certain scientific restructuring or change or building something that didn't exist. managing family or society and the economy in accordance with certain scientific principles by an elite of social engineers, experts who know how to do that. So there is a close connection between this idea that you can use that you can build the edifice of economic theory as an exact science, in the same sense physics and chemistry are, and this political ambition to change society or to control society via science. Can you give me some examples of social engineering in the economic area today? Attempts to change the way how economic system functions by the governments. It is based on a certain idea of scientific control. Yeah, you did one. Yeah. There are plenty of examples of that. Do you think that the welfare state is a social engineering enterprise? And in which sense you can argue that the welfare state is a social engineering? Would it be exaggeration to say that it is? Or central banking? So we use interest rates and monetary policy to change the way how the economy is functioning. Not only to provide its stability, but to change how it works. So whenever you use the instruments of government policy to change, to fundamentally transform the way how certain aspect of society or certain part of society functions, you're engaged in social engineering. So whenever you think that there is something wrong fundamentally with the society and you think that you can fix it by using government, you're engaged in one or another form of social engineering. So this role of scientific expert is the picture of an economist that emerges from Hazlitt's theory is a picture of an disinterested or abstract thinker, commentator, philosopher, who stands athwart progress or who stands outside of society and analyzes it. Whereas in this scientific economics, social engineering economics expert is a part of is a part of government essentially. It's an expert whose expertise is necessary in order for government to fulfill its tasks. Independence of the central bank. Ever thought why central bank is independent from political pressures? I say that President Trump said something against the Federal Reserve Chairman, and then the chorus of criticism was leveled at him that he is endangering the sacred institution of the independence of the central bank. It's very simple, because the central bank's task was considered to be a scientific management of our financial system. And you don't want stupid, illiterate politicians to intrude into what experts do. Experts know what they do. They're here to scientifically manage the financial system. And now you have this bad orange man, or who politician who has something to say, who criticizes and who demeans the experts. That's a social engineering ethos. Whenever you hear that, our public servants, they know what is best, whatever. Dr. Fauci. There are a certain subset of American demographics that says that you cannot. whenever you challenge one of these people, you're criticized as being stepping over the bounds of allowed behavior. Because it is assumed that there is one sector of the government that should be exempt from democratic political control. It has very profound implications for our way of life, whether we accept that as illegitimate or not, for politics. Whether we think that the Federal Reserve System should be completely independent, if they decide tomorrow to create 100% inflation rate, whether the elected officials should have a right to do something about it. I don't know. According to the existing law, they shouldn't be doing it. And those critics of President Trump were correct insofar as the elected officials shouldn't have a right to meddle on a day-to-day basis of what Federal Reserve does. But then again, we're a democratic society on paper, have a constitution, begins with we the people. We're very proud of that. Now, what kind of democracy is that when some of the most important decisions that about our lives are not made by people whom we elected, but rather by some unelected bureaucrats? The administrative state. That's also an issue that is connected deeply to the problem of how we understand economics. Do economists have a role to play here as experts, as a part of the administrative state that scientifically manages our lives? Should our lives, now that's the normative question that we have to ask. Should our lives be scientifically managed? Now, we cannot answer that scientifically. That's the problem. We can answer that only based on certain philosophical commitments or principles that we have that cannot be derived from scientific truth. Philosopher Moore said, ought cannot be derived from is, but something ought to be cannot be derived from the statement of facts. Normative conclusions do not follow directly from the facts. So see, we said economics should be a value-neutral science. It means economic truths should be true, should apply whatever your personal opinions or values are, and that's true. But also, economics is connected to economics is social science. And whenever you have human society and interpersonal relationships, it's always a tricky terrain. It's always bound up or connected to philosophical, ethical, moral, religious problems. Okay. Any comments? Any questions? Okay. So I wanted to finish this way. So the main thing from today that I will write down in the study guide will be about this business cycle policy and the public works. So I will post this today, and then on Thursday we will meet again and we'll have a chance to chat about everything and to prepare for the final exam. So thank you for an interesting semester to all of you. And hopefully I will meet at least some of you in other economics classes next time. And good luck, stay safe, take care of yourself, but I'm not gonna give you any advice, but stay safe and stay calm. And I'll see you then on Thursday.